no margin for error, right?
That's correct. I mean, you are talking feet. We're not talking yards or...
The two Russian fighter jets sped by the USS Donald Cook within yards of the destroyer's bridge.
But analysts say we're in a very dangerous period.
It's absolutely the worst it's been since the end of the Cold War.
Is that tail number 3-4?
NATO is viewed as an existential threat to Russia. Our military capability, they view in a very visceral way as a threat to Russia.
Russia is adding or upgrading some 12 naval bases across the Arctic Circle, expanding its capability to send subs in numbers through the crucial Greenland-Iceland-UK gap into the Atlantic and closer to U.S. and NATO territorial waters. Russia is deploying its ballistic missile and attack submarines in numbers, range, and aggression not seen in 2 decades. In an exclusive interview, the commander of U.S. naval forces in Europe tells CNN the buildup is part of an alarming strategic view.
They're very clear that NATO is viewed as an existential threat to Russia. Our military capability, they view in a very visceral way as a threat to Russia.
Adding to U.S. concern, Russia is deploying new submarines that are harder for U.S. naval forces to track and detect. Following years and billions of dollars in investment, they are quieter, better armed, and have a greater range of operation.
The submarines that we're seeing are much more stealthy. They're acoustically quieter. We're seeing them have more advanced weapon systems, missile systems that can attack land at long ranges.
The increased Russian sub-activity is backed by a much broader military expansion. Russia is adding or upgrading some 12 naval bases across the Arctic Circle, expanding its capability to send subs in numbers through the crucial Greenland-Iceland-UK gap into the Atlantic and closer to U.S. and NATO territorial waters. Moscow has also newly stationed 6 submarines in the Black Sea, giving Russia new capability into the Mediterranean. The U.S. believes the new activity is designed to deny NATO, including the U.S., the ability to operate within Russia's so-called near abroad.
What we see in these operations, it's focused on protecting the maritime flanks of Russia, but also denying NATO the ability to operate within the maritime flanks as well. And I'm speaking of the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and areas in the far North Atlantic around Norway.
Increasingly alarmed by Russia's new sub-deployments, the U.S. and its NATO allies are launching new training exercises in anti-sub warfare and deploying new systems, including the P-8 Poseidon.
What's that right there?
CNN got an exclusive trip on the Navy's most advanced sub-Hunter last May.
These are sonar buoys dropped into the water to track submarines. The plane can be equipped with torpedoes to destroy those submarines.
Russia's growing military activity extends above the surface as well. A Russian fighter jet's flyby of the USS Donald Cook this week, coming within 30 feet laterally and 100 feet vertically, is behavior that U.S. naval commanders have not witnessed since the Cold War.
We had issued radio calls in both English and Russian, and the aircraft didn't respond and proceeded on a course directly at the ship. So while we've seen these interactions before, this one was different because of the proximity to the ship, the altitude, and the flight path that it took.
Below the bridge wing. Below the bridge wing.
Some call these moves strafing runs without the firing. Tonight, U.S. officials still furious over the buzzing of an American Navy ship by Russian combat jets. America's top diplomat calling the incident in the Baltic Sea reckless, provocative.
Under the rules of engagement, that could have been a shoot down. So people need to understand that this is serious business. and the United States is not going to be intimidated.
In wave after wave, Russian jets buzzed the USS Donald Cook, at certain points coming within 30 feet of the ship.
No margin for error, right?
That's correct. I mean, you are talking feet. We're not talking yards or miles. We're talking feet. And basically, if this pilot, sneezed or looked a different direction and the plane went another way, bang, it could have hit the ship.
The Russian jets were not armed. Russian officials are defending their actions tonight, saying these flybys were in accordance with international rules. But analysts say we're in a very dangerous period.
It's absolutely the worst it's been since the end of the Cold War.
The USS Cook was operating in international waters, but only about 70 miles off the Russian territory of Kaliningrad, where the Russians have military ports. That, plus the capabilities of the American Aegis destroyer, likely got under Vladimir Putin's skin.
This ship has the most advanced radar capability in the fleet of the United States Navy. It not only can detect missiles, but it also can shoot down missiles. And this is probably what irritated the Russians, not only that it was operating out in the sea, but also close to their shores.
Putin is being as aggressive as ever, using his ramped-up military to threaten his neighbors, provoke the U.S., push every envelope, all with a clear message: we must be respected.
Putin's narrative is one of strength, right? So at home, it's he got us off our knees. Internationally, it's we are capable of standing up to the United States and other countries to assert our interests.
Well, Russia's defense ministry has rejected criticism that one of its jets made aggressive maneuvers near a U.S. reconnaissance plane over the Baltic Sea. U.S. military officials say a Russian interceptor flew within 50 feet of the U.S. aircraft, which it says was making a routine flight, and carried out a risky barrel roll as it flew past in international airspace. The U.S. says the action was unsafe and unprofessional. Russia, though, says that version of events is, quote, running counter to reality. The defense officials in Moscow say Russian air defenses were scrambled after detecting a high-speed, unidentified target heading for Russia's borders. After visual contact was made, the defense official said the U.S. plane changed course. Officials say there was no emergency situations and that the Russian flight was in strict conformity with international rules. But of course, this is the second close encounter between the U.S. and Russian militaries in just the past few days. Last week in the same area, Russian jets buzzed a U.S. warship, the USS Donald Cook, apparently simulating attack passages. The U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry condemned that as dangerous and provocative. Under the rules of engagement, he said, the jets could have been shot down. Matthew Chance, CNN Moscow.
Topping our world lead today, tensions between the U.S. and Russia are boiling over close calls on the high seas and at high altitude. Just days after a Russian fighter jet buzzed the USS Donald Cook in the Black Sea, coming within 30 feet of the guided missile destroyer, a Russian jet flew within 50 feet of an American surveillance aircraft's wingtip high over the Baltic Sea. U.S. officials say the flights are at best unprofessional. At worst, they risk military confrontation. The two Russian fighter jets sped by the USS Donald Cook within yards of the destroyer's bridge, ignoring, the Pentagon says, repeated radio calls to the pilots in English and Russian. It is just the latest in a series of flybys the U.S. has repeatedly deemed unsafe and unprofessional. But this one, the commander of U.S. naval forces in Europe told CNN, was unprecedented.
The behavior that we saw from the pilots engaged in this operation was very different in its aggressiveness, lack of communication, and proximity to the ship.
So close that Secretary of State John Kerry warned publicly that the Cook could have shot the Russian jet down.
It is reckless, it is provocative, it is dangerous, it is unprofessional, and under the rules of engagement, that could have been a shoot down.
The flybys follow months of increased tensions between the U.S. and Russia over the conflicts in Ukraine and Syria. And it is not the first.
Coming starboard side.
In June, a Russian Su-24 jet flew within about 1,600 feet of a U.S. guided missile destroyer in the Black Sea. That was followed by similar flybys of U.S. aircraft carriers and jets. In all, there have been hundreds of intercepts between Russian and U.S. aircraft in the past couple of years. In the case of the Cook, U.S. Navy officials tell CNN, Commanders on board quickly determined the Russian jets were not a threat. The ship's instruments indicating they were not armed and did not employ targeting radar to lock on or light up the ship.
Those ships are very sophisticated. We can make decisions about whether they live or die from great distances with great speed, but we don't want to do that unless it's absolutely necessary and it's absolutely supported by our rules of engagement.
The Russian Defense Ministry told state media that Russia acted, quote, in accordance with international rules. The Russian embassy in Washington taking a more lighthearted tack, tweeting to CNN and others, keep calm when Russian jets are around. These aces know how to fly, along with a link to a series of videos showing Russian fighter jets performing aerial stunts.
I asked the U.S. Navy if the U.S. rules of engagement would have allowed the crew of the USS Donald Cook to shoot down the Russian jets. A Navy official told me the following, quote, every commanding officer of a U.S. Navy ship is empowered to make the decision regarding the self-defense of the ship and its crew. Again, in this case, the commanding officer recognized that the flight patterns were unsafe and unprofessional, but did not feel threatened and therefore did not engage with tactical weapons.